So I started going to our planning commission meetings when I was, I guess, 11 years old. I had decided that we really needed a crosswalk in our community. And this was something that I was going to advocate for. And because of where I grew up, and I had kind of the belief that we as citizens, as community members, could really make a difference and should be enabled to be involved in policy. And so I would say kind of that upbringing, that context is what inspired me to get involved as a researcher in public management, in social policy. If we could figure out how to get social entrepreneurs or their networks and their supporters more engaged with governments and the public sector, we could be developing stronger policies. We could be building more resilient communities. And at the time, Scotland was, heralded, and I think still is, as a shining example of this collaboration between the social enterprise sector, the ecosystem of support that they had developed, and the public sector and government. The simplest level, what is policy co-production? It's about getting governments and communities working together on policy and then the associated services flowing from those policies. And I think that that's one of the definitional challenges in scholarship. We often see it as this like linear stacked thing. You have policy and you design that, and then you have services and you deliver them. And really, the policy cycle is very complicated. You're constantly planning and designing and implementing and evaluating.
Invisible Experts Podcast.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us again on this new episode in our podcast, Invisible Experts. This podcast is hosted by me, Andres Morales, and today we welcome Dr. Maeve Curtin, or Maeve, We're going to try to talk about policy and social enterprise based upon her experience in both as a practitioner as well as an academic. And for us, it's very excited, and it is very exciting having you in our podcast. So welcome, Maeve. It's good to see you again after a long time. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. It really has been a while, but I was thrilled to hear from you and get the opportunity to join, chat about, what academic doesn't love talking about their research. So
That's cool. That's cool. Thank you for this. I mean, we are trying to bring both of you, like practitioners and academics, and we are lucky having you because you are kind of both, especially with your involvement with the Social Enterprise World Forum, and you have the opportunity to get in touch and get in contact with a lot of practitioners from all over the world. So if you don't mind, maybe introduce yourself briefly, then our little community know who you are, what you up to, and what is your basically like research about.
Sure. Well, thank you. And once again, Andres, thank you so much for asking. I've always really admired your work because you do kind of transcend those boundaries of being a scholar, being a practitioner, and understanding how to speak to both communities. I think that that's so important because there are research insights that can benefit social entrepreneurs, policymakers, individuals kind of on the ground doing a lot of this work. And equally, academics can learn a lot from and need indeed the practitioners to do the work. I wouldn't have been able to do my research, do my PhD if I hadn't had the goodwill and buy-in from lots of pioneering leaders in the social enterprise community in different countries around the world. So I guess I'll back up a little bit to introduce myself broader to this community. So I'm Maeve. I am based in Massachusetts right now in the US in Boston, but have had experience living around the world, did my PhD in Glasgow in Scotland, and just moved back to the States recently to start a new role. But I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in a very small, what we called the little city, where we had our own school district and our own city councils and lots of different governing bodies. And it meant that there were tons of opportunities for people to get involved in politics at a very local level, at a level where you could really see the ways in which your contributions at meetings were impacting your daily life in the community. So I started going to our planning commission meetings when I was, I guess, 11 years old. I had decided that we really needed a crosswalk in our community, and this was something that I was going to advocate for. And because of where I grew up, and I had kind of the belief that we as citizens, as community members, could really make a difference and should be enabled to be involved in policy. And so I would say kind of that upbringing, that context is what inspired me to get involved as a researcher in public management, in social policy, to really try to understand how citizens, communities can be more engaged in the policies that impact them, and what are kind of the arrangements, what are the mechanisms we need to use on the public sector side, so governments, to encourage more people to be actively involved in policymaking, whether that's contributing to a strategy around social enterprise, whether that's participating in designing and delivering healthcare policy. That sort of my early interest in civic engagement and democratic engagement is really what kind of inspired me to start this journey. I guess it was in 2019 when I moved to Scotland to work for Social Enterprise World Forum. And at that time, it wasn't going to be that long of an endeavor. I ended up staying with World Forum for about 5 years and doing many different roles, traveling, meeting you, lots of this exciting stuff. But part of what I saw, social enterprise was a tool for economic inclusion, for inclusive development, equitable community development, and that social enterprises were solving lots of the challenges we were facing in our communities, and that there was a unique tie, perhaps, between social enterprise and public sector policy. And if we could figure out how to get social entrepreneurs or their networks and their supporters more engaged with governments in the public sector, we could be developing stronger policies, we could be building more resilient communities. And at the time, Scotland was, heralded, and I think still is, as a shining example of this collaboration between the social enterprise sector, the ecosystem of support that they had developed, and the public sector and government. So I was really keen to go and learn a little bit from the Scottish case, and ended up getting into a situation where I was studying it for my PhD.
Wow, that's very interesting, huh? Such a young age, and you just listen if you've been like living for 30 years. That's crazy, right? I'm wondering, like, how is it the social enterprise? And for our audience, social enterprise is a company as any other company, but the difference is like its mission and is to create social or environmental value. So I was wondering, from the US perspective, how does it look in social enterprise? Or,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a good question. And part of my rationale for leaving, I had done, I was really interested in economic development in the US, and thought that might have been the career I went into. And I saw social enterprise as a tool for that development. But we weren't talking about social enterprise in the US. There were a few organizations who were doing that work, but people were using the terminology globally. You see it in a lot of European countries, the UK, and it's growing in popularity. But one thing that I think is really important, and that I've come to learn and believe wholeheartely since really getting involved in organizations like Social Enterprise World Forum, is social enterprises aren't new, right? It's not, you have historic cooperatives, this is a model that has helped communities grow and flourish and sustain themselves for centuries. And what is new, which we happen in a lot of contexts, right? You put a term on something, you try to make it new, you try to make it such, and then you shape it in a particular image. And there's political work happening in that. So there's, the second you call something or a particular organization a social enterprise, there are lots of different sort of meanings and attachments that get looped into that. And in certain places, you'll hear people talk about the social economy or the social and solidarity economy. And there are reasons culturally, historically, why people wouldn't want to say social, like enterprise, right? Because that is seen as something different. And in the US, people can use various terms. I think social enterprise is becoming more of a popular term. But at the end of the day, I think terminology is less important than understanding the values, what is underpinning something. So we need to be clear about kind of underlying motivations and mechanisms for engaging in, for building your business or an organization in a particular way. Or if you look at my PhD research, why are we engaging in sort of collaborative policy co-production or engagement? I'm less interested in what we actually call it, as long as we're very clear about what's sitting underneath it. And one thing that I started working on before I ended up leaving Social Enterprise World Forum was a campaign that's now called, People and Planet First, to say that, look, across geographic borders, it could be in the US, it could be in Malaysia, it could be in South Africa, Chile, wherever you want to put your pin on the map. These businesses, these social enterprises exist, but we're not necessarily calling them that. If we try to force other people to use the language we're using, whether it's kind of a Western centric or whatever the history is around it, we're not going to accomplish something that we can if we sort of put those terminological boundaries and barriers to the side, unite around a shared set of common values, and really say this is a strong movement that can shift economies, not just in one local community, but actually globally. And that's really what the People and Planet First movement is trying to do. And in the US, using that language has been really helpful in gaining traction with private sector leaders, with government leaders who would say to you, well, social enterprise, we don't really know what that is, or that's not what we're engaging with. We're interested in diverse suppliers, or we're going to focus on, the environmental components of ESG. If you sort of sit down with someone and say, look, we're here to talk about organizations that are putting people and planet first, people get that. They're like, yes, okay, yeah, that's what I've been doing. I may have been calling it something different than you, but I think in the US, it's picking up a lot of traction because we're being less territorial with our language and kind of using common sets of values that are underpinning the missions of these organizations to unite and accelerate folks.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I think, when I think about the US and the social enterprise sector slash social economy or third sector, I don't know.
Sure.
I always think about philanthropy, right? Because I think the US, at least, no, globally, I would say, they're leading a lot of projects in terms, like social
Sure.
change, the global concerns about how the world is kind of like addressing challenges locally, globally, and so on and so forth. So philanthropy is key, right? In the US, let's say, maybe context. So I want to ask you, like, having having experience living in both, like, let's say, Western territories, the US and Europe, could you actually identify differences, not only in terms of terminology, but perhaps culturally? And the reason why I'm asking you this is because I don't know if you are familiar with the work of Nichols, from the
Yes.
UK. Yeah, remember that he used this kind of discourses, right? Rather than terminology, he actually talked about discourses, and then he talked about this kind of social hero or social heroic figure that
Entrepreneur, yeah.
social exactly heroic entrepreneur that is more it's kind of like legitimated by some institutions in the US. And then when you think about social businesses, a more kind of like business, like you talk about the UK, and then you have this kind of like community-based enterprises, like you talk about more Southern Europe, like Spain, Greece, Italy. And then you have this kind of social and solidarity economy section, which is more in the Latin American, context. But I was thinking,
Sure.
like, since I have the opportunity to travel around like you, right?
Mhm.
I actually see a lot of similarities. But also,
Sure.
I believe there is a cultural aspect within the sector. So maybe you can share from your perspective if you can identify like this kind of cultural, let's say, integration within these kind of organizations, uh, like based on the geographical context, or what do you think about it?
Sure. I mean, I think that social enterprise, the third sector, whatever, it's very informed by kind of the nature of the public sector. Do you have a public sector that is heavily invested in public services? I mean, sometimes you'll say things like, of course, delivery of public services. And that makes a lot of sense in a Nordic context or in a European context where the state has a huge apparatus for delivering healthcare and education and all these other kind of social services that you don't see as much investment in a place like the US. So you think about, why is philanthropy so important in the United States? Well, it's because you don't have a huge state providing those services. So with a lack of public investment, that the model has really been, okay, we don't collect as many taxes, people invest those in philanthropic organizations, those organizations provide the services, instead of the state is providing those services and everyone is kind of bought into this collective community model. And you see varying degrees to which that is true across, Europe is not a monolith. The US is certainly not a monolith. You have states who have very different sort of social service systems. So I do think that there is a difference based on kind of what is the nature of the public sector in a particular context. And of course, the third sector, social enterprises, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, well, not those who are receiving the philanthropic investment, respond to that appropriately. But what I will also say, I mean, you started the question by asking about Alex Nichols' work and sort of the discourse around social entrepreneurs and the heroic entrepreneur narrative. He's also written a lot with Simon Teasdale, and Simon's work also talks about kind of different social enterprise discourses in the UK, right? So it's not just about, you can identify the community discourse. You can identify kind of the more business profit, right? Like people emphasize different parts of a social enterprise based on kind of what resonates with people. So in societies that I think are a little bit more community or public sector kind of service focused, they talk about the additive ways in which social enterprises can help strengthen public service delivery, or be more responsive to community needs, where in a US context you may talk about a social enterprise having a nonprofit sort of social or environmental mission. But in fact, because they've developed an enterprising model, they're not going to be grant reliant. And so that is seen as like, oh, business prowess, and kind of the trading impact is often what's emphasized more than like, oh, look at this good social component of it. And I think it just depends. I've heard people talk about how you keep social enterprise on an agenda when governments shift. And it's totally related to that narrative building around what parts of sort of the social enterprise sector do you choose to emphasize, and what's going to resonate with a particular government. People talk about the chameleonic nature of a social enterprise, that it can kind of blend and meld to different things. You can frame it in a different way. And I think that you see that not only in different geographies, but you also see it within countries during political shifts or not. You see it in sub-state nations, right? Scotland, their social enterprise sector has a very different feel from what you find down in England. Same in a place like Quebec with the social economy. People say social economy in Quebec, and it's much more about that democratic community engagement. In other provinces in Canada, they're talking about social enterprise. And so underlying philosophy and values the same, terminology different, and that sort of the discourses that are emphasized, like the meanings that are attached to those terms, tend to be fairly similar, but maybe are emphasized in different ways based on context.
Sure, sure. This is actually really, really like inspiring, because when I was reading your PhD thesis, even though it was, you know, it's a PhD thesis, is a bit long, I was like,
I can't believe you read it all.
yeah, I had to know, because before to meeting you, I mean, I like kind of skim it, but
Yeah.
but
The high level.
but I went to the whole thing. And, you know, I love the fact how you connect this kind of like public arena, right,
Mhm.
with the work that enterprises are doing. And my understanding, or at least what I get, I don't know if you did it intentionally, but I can see how you understand globally, right, the role of the public arena, and then those
Mhm.
actors who are trying to create this social and environmental value. So after this kind of introduction, I can see why you were so inspired to write about it. You know, policy work, social work, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very interesting how you see, okay, look, when there are areas where the public, let's say the state, is more proactive in order to provide social services, you know,
Sure.
so you can see this connection in between, you know, the state and the organizations, because they are informed by them. But when you happen to be in the US, some countries like, let's say, Latin America, are in Africa, that the state, they don't provide as much as those in other contexts. You can see how this individuality, if you wish, you know, create a different taste of
Mhm.
what they could deliver, right? So
Yeah.
if we focus on your PhD research,
Okay.
you know, it was very interesting about this kind of policy co-production, right? In the context, of course, of social enterprises. But I
Mhm.
want to ask you, what do you mean by policy co-production? And then our audience can understand what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, this is kind of one of those that it sits at the crux of the PhD. So I started this research saying that I was going to be studying co-production, and I was going to be studying co-production between the Scottish social enterprise sector and the Scottish government. And what happened is I started talking to a lot of public management scholars about this, who would say, well, co-production is public service delivery. Co-production is when, you know, citizens work with service providers. So people who are receiving healthcare services are actively involved in designing and delivering what those healthcare services or childcare services might look like in their communities. And what you're talking about is something entirely different. But I was sitting here thinking, okay, maybe I am talking about something different, but nevertheless, everyone who I'm speaking to is using this terminology co-production. So what do you do with that when you have scholars in one context saying, well, this is what this concept, this phenomenon is this, and we're putting boxes around it. And then you have practitioners saying, well, we're doing that. I mean, or at least using that term, we might be doing something slightly different. So I said, listen, I can't all of a sudden just call what these people are doing in these communities something entirely different. I can't change their language. I wanted to have respect and understand what they meant, what they were talking about. And so over time, I realized, okay, this is a form of co-production. It's policy co-production, maybe. And no one's really talking about what policy co-production is. But as we see trends in collaboration across sectors increasing, we've seen strategies, you know, the African Union strategy for the social and solidarity economy actively calls on member states to co-produce social enterprise strategies with entrepreneurs and networks within their countries. So whether or not scholars are a fan of kind of the way that language has been adopted in a slightly different context, I think is kind of besides the point. We as researchers need to be responding to those collaborative trends in governance. And it goes back to some of what we were talking about, social enterprise being called different things in different contexts. Like in the US, collaborative governance is what is used. People like Emerson and Nabachi's work around collaborative governance was hugely helpful to framing my PhD in my research. In Australia, a lot of the public management scholars are talking about co-design. In the, Europe and UK, you hear co-production. In other places, you would just hear collaboration. You have some scholars who say, why don't you just call it collaboration? Like, why are we so worried about assigning terms to different things? But regardless of it is important to be clear about what we're talking about. I think it's less important to be very territorial around, definitional boundaries. So when I say policy co-production, for me, it was both kind of a public management practice. So the ways in which public sector government can work with citizens, communities, organizations in different sectors to facilitate sort of democratic engagement, little d democratic engagement, and also policy co-production as a policy tool. So a tool in practice that leads to more responsive policies and effective outcomes, because you have the people who are going to be recipients or benefiting from the policy and associated services actively telling government, in order for this strategy to be successful, in order for this policy to be successful, this is what our community needs. And these are the types of services and programs that we believe you should be designing and helping us implement so that we can all collectively advance our shared ambitions around having more equitable and just societies, so we can have social enterprises that are contributing to better healthcare outcomes in our communities, for example. So, I mean, I guess at the simplest level, what is policy co-production? It's about getting governments and communities working together on policy and then the associated services flowing from those policies. And I think that that's one of the definitional challenges in scholarship. We often see it as this like linear stacked thing. You have policy and you design that, and then you have services and you deliver them. And really, the policy cycle is very complicated. You're constantly planning and designing and implementing and evaluating. And so I was talking about policy co-production for my PhD because I thought it was much more all-encompassing of this like complicated project of designing a sector-based strategy where you're going to implement programs and then you're going to develop action plans and then you're going to go back to the original strategy and you're going to try to sustain some things and you're going to reevaluate the way things are working.
Yeah. When I was reading your piece of work, I was thinking like it is beneficiary-based policy making. Okay, what I mean by that is what the businesses are doing nowadays is client-based. They listen to the clients and then they make products based on their needs. So that's why I love it, because when I was reading through it, it's the same logic, right? So basically policy makers, rather than work top down, they actually get down and they talk to the beneficiaries, which are community groups, voluntary groups, people in need, vulnerable groups, and so on and so forth. And then they understand their needs and they co-produce policies in the, policymakers' jargon in order to put in practice what they listen about. So that's why I think it was very interesting, your piece of work, because it's basically what businesses are doing. So you make it more pragmatic and more practical. So I was wondering whether in your research, when you were conducting it, do you have a specific example for it? Like for our audience to understand how this is, practiced in real life. So what I'm trying to say is like how policymakers and communities meet, where is the context, or how they actually create these conversations, or how does it works, And I was wondering that because back in the day, I did a little research in Iceland, okay? And there's this social enterprise organization, and they use e-democracy, right? So the way that they were actually talking, it was through technology. So basically,
Mm-hmm.
policymakers, they listen to the public and they have a list, and then everybody votes and they implement based on this. So based on the context that you studied, how does it look like? If you have perhaps an example to understand how it's happening.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I was studying massive strategy development. So
Okay.
if you were to say, like, how does a country develop its business strategy or its technology strategy or its social enterprise strategy? This is not a discrete, how are we going to deliver childcare in this one city for children age 2 to 4? So the examples are kind of broad, and I will do my best to explain them. But one thing that I think is important and maybe distinguishes some of this like grassroots up engagement from private sector work, right? Private sector businesses have always done focus groups with clients. What do you think of this product? What would you want us to develop more? And it has this sort of transactional nature about it. Like it's a one and done kind of thing. You come in, you tell us, we're going to ask you, we're going to respond to that. And maybe we'll go back one more time, maybe we won't. The government historically has also had something that we call public consultation. So, okay, and maybe that was some of what you had in Iceland. Maybe it was a little different. Maybe it was tech enabled or not. But you know, there were always, I started out by telling you, I got interested in this when I was very actively engaged in my community and going to city council meetings. We always had consultation periods. If we were going to put out a new policy, we, you know, put it on a website. We would go around to communities and ask people to share feedback on that specific thing. And then we would incorporate it. What is different about co-production and policy co-production is that you're not starting, maybe you have some semblance of an idea, like we want to have a strategy, but the government isn't first saying, here's the draft. Okay, social enterprises, tell us what you think, and we'll go back and we'll do it. In Scotland, the case of the social enterprise strategy and what became very clear is it was one of the only, maybe not the only, but people seem to remember it in that way, people from the Scottish government, document that was principally written outside of the public sector. So what does that look like? That looks like multiple community sessions where if you've ever done one of those, like, let's reimagine climate action or let's reimagine government workshops, and you can picture quite literally like Post-it notes all around a room, and people are saying, well, if we had our blank slate world, this is what we would want to see from government, and this is what the investment would look like. And you start putting those things all up around the room, and you get someone, you know, it kind of an external party who has a lot of trust and legitimacy in the sector, who also knows how to work with government to say and synthesize, here are the priorities that we're seeing, here are the themes, here are how these things are aligning. Let's try to now, after, you know, 20 consultation sessions in different remote and rural communities all around, and in the big cities too, but all around the country. And then we've also had kind of an open forum online where we've collected hundreds of responses, and we're going to bring that all together, but we're going to have someone within the sector write it. And then we're going to do this consultation part where we go out and we say, okay, we think this is what you said to us. Is this really what you said? Is this what you want? And then people in the social enterprise sector would say, well, yes, this part, but not this. And can we add this into the document? And so it's kind of this very back and forth process where the draft originated with the people and the organizations who were going to stand to need it or to benefit from it most. So instead of saying government knows best what these communities needs, and it's more expensive, it's more time consuming, it's really hard to sustain, right? Scotland did it really well in 2014, 2015, 2016, before their strategy launched. Well, it's a 10-year strategy, and the engagement with the social enterprise sector it's very different now. Some of that is probably by design. Others, I think, how it has evolved over time, perhaps not intentionally, but yeah, very practically, like these design and visioning strategies. Like if you were to think design thinking stock image, like that's really what I'm talking about. And doing that for government policy, and then allowing communities to kind of start the draft, start the vision, and then continue to be involved. So it's not once we have the policy and it's been passed, it's been approved, it has its ministerial sign off, we're done. No, you continue to engage with the group. You continue, and Scotland operationalized that in the form of 3-year action plans. So it was almost embedded into the strategy that government couldn't stop engaging. I don't know if that was concrete enough.
That was fantastically
Yeah.
explained. Yeah, it was
Okay.
super clear. Yeah, it is. And also, like, I think people maybe would think that would be the way to go, to make policies, right? And that's why I want to ask you. So, is this something that was created in Scotland, this kind of policy co-production, or is this something that you just found out throughout your research? Because it's very, from my perspective, it's definitely game changing, because this is how we talk. This is actual a democratic process to create policies. I mean, you include
Yeah.
the people who are experts in it. You try to include all the voices. And I if I'm not mistaken, you use the word kind of cross-sector collaboration.
Cross-sector, yes.
Exactly, which is fantastic. And when you put it in, so this is something like they create, because it's very innovative.
It is, yeah. And so, I mean, what I loved about my research was that it was not only about process innovation and policy innovation, so that the process itself was innovative, but the policy was also around social innovation and supporting social entrepreneurs and social enterprises to go innovate in their own communities. So it was kind of, it was both, which I loved being able to engage in that way. Was this created in Scotland? I mean, no, I think people have been developing policy in sort of collaborative ways and calling it different things. Scotland, however, though, there are research, Paul Kearney, for example, is one who talks about kind of Scotland's reputation for developing a collaborative and consultative policymaking style. And frankly, it was a sort of soft power tool for Scotland to advance its reputation on the international stage in this way. And the social enterprise strategy, yes, Scotland does it with healthcare and with other things, and it's a smaller nation. So it has the ability to engage communities in a way that some other countries don't. Of course, that type of engagement is prioritized by government leaders who believe that that is the right way to make policy, right? Like you don't end up with co-produced policymaking and service delivery if you don't have buy-in from the public sector leaders who really believe that that's going to lead to better outcomes and it's worth the additional time and financial investment in developing policies that way. But I do think Scotland has a reputation for doing it, and examples of where it has been very collaborative and consultative and working wholeheartedly on investing in like a co-produced policy and strategy. Other countries, though, other communities do it. I cited, the African Union Social and Solidarity Economy Strategy, and they use this language too around co-production, around that being very important and a central part of the success for social and solidarity economy strategy in the nation going in various countries across the African continent going forward.
Okay, wow. So basically, as a part of this process of policy co-production, is it safe to say that there is a process of cross-sector collaboration, right?
Yes, I think it is, because to co-do whatever is co-production, co-design, co-delivery, whatever you want to call it, and I think co-production is kind of a more all-encompassing term. You can't co-produce something just within the public sector. You know, you need to have additional experience and expertise. Some people would argue that in order for something to really be co-produced, you need to go directly to the citizens, the individuals. In the case of a social enterprise strategy, I think going directly to some social enterprises, but also the intermediary organizations who themselves might be social enterprises, but who certainly are there and exist to represent these organizations, they also need to be involved. So you have the third sector, but you also would have business voices, right, involved in some of this strategy development. So in Scotland, yes, it was predominantly the social enterprise networks and social entrepreneurs, what we would call the third sector. But you would also have private sector voices, you would have government voices. And so then it's a very tri-sector form of collaboration. And I do think once you get more voices, you get more perspectives, you are making stronger strategies, stronger policies. You have more individuals and organizations who are bought in. And that's tough for negotiation. Sometimes that could mean policy priorities get diluted if you have too many people with too many, with a multitude of perspectives. But I would also argue that even if it takes longer to distill and figure out, what should end up in that final policy or that final sort of articulation of a particular service, you're going to be better off for having gone through that iterative process of negotiation.
That's really interesting. Maeve, I was wondering, okay, is here Scotland divided by counties, right?
Local authority areas, but yes, kind of
Okay.
counties. Sure.
So this kind of in practice, co-production processes for public policies, is it happen? Is it decentralized or is it centralized? Or how does it work?
So when the Scottish government, like national Scottish government, most of their social policy making is devolved from the UK government. So, I mean, Scotland is a very unique case to study because it's particularly nested. You have some of the financial policy and other policy happening at a United Kingdom level and coming from Westminster. But in terms of health services and anything that pretty much relates to social enterprise, the Scottish government is that's their responsibility. Yes. And so what I studied was at that sub-state nation level. So I was looking at Scotland. I also did some work on Australia, in my work with Social Enterprise World Forum, looked at work that was happening in many different countries around the world. But specifically thinking about, okay, how does that trickle down from Scotland to the various local authorities? In Scotland, because it had such a robust network of or ecosystem for social enterprise, there were like Highland and Island networks, or Glasgow and Edinburgh had their own social enterprise networks. And some of them even had their own social enterprise strategies. And so the idea was that you would have kind of an overarching thing for the entire country, but then you would also have localized implementation plans and additional ways for local communities to really invest in what made sense to them, because the needs in a city like Glasgow or Edinburgh, even in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the central belt of Scotland, will be different. But then you have very isolated island communities or remote and rural areas where social enterprises are going to be serving different types of needs. Scotland has very robust kind of mapping research around the social enterprise sector, and there is in the Highlands and Islands areas, so kind of in the borders of Scotland, social enterprises and community enterprises specifically that are designed to sort of sustain communities where historically maybe there hasn't been as much investment, or where just because of the way of life and supporting one another, a lot of businesses develop are just naturally social enterprises because of the way people engage in those areas. And so, yes, there are sometimes strategies that differ, but would still have some alignment at the national level. It would be akin to kind of overarching strategy and then localized implementation plan. How are we going to take the services that maybe that strategy has developed for us and the funding that maybe will come to us to deliver services for social enterprises in our communities and ensure that it's hyper responsive to local needs?
Well, yeah, I think it's like super innovative. Like when I was reading your piece of work, it is very inspiring. Could you please share some key factors that you might identify that help sustain cross-sector collaboration over time, and therefore delivering these co-production policy processes?
Yeah, sure. So what I sort of I used the framework. I think I mentioned this already. Emerson and Nabachi's work on collaborative governance. They had a 2012 article about an integrative framework for collaborative governance. And it was really useful when I was trying to identify these different factors and kind of isolate things that participants and different individuals who had been involved in the strategy process were saying about what really made it work, and particularly not only what made it work, but why their perceptions of its value decreased to them over time. And so they have kind of three different things they talk about, which is principled engagement, shared motivation, and capacity for joint action. And so principled engagement is kind of behavioral things. So working on defining something collectively, deliberating, determining things. Shared motivation has to do with kind of the interpersonal elements and dynamics. So do people trust each other? Are they committed to this? Is there a shared understanding? Does that create legitimacy for a process? And then the capacity for joint action, which is what seemed to shift the most. And if you think about it, actually, that's maybe perhaps intuitive, right? People's ability to act collaboratively, the capacity they have to act jointly, that being the one factor that kind of has an outsized, all of it is important, but that factor having an outsized influence over whether or not people can co-produce or work collaboratively together does sort of make sense. But this article was all theoretical. So to my knowledge, this is the PhD was one of the first pieces of work testing it a little bit more empirically, in recognizing that, okay, so the functional elements associated with people's capacity to act jointly and co-produce things together, like the leadership. So what is the philosophy of government leaders? And when leaders in the public sector change, the process changes dramatically because they have different philosophies, they have different styles, they have different, it relates to the interpersonal elements, they have different understanding of what should happen in the process. But importantly, resources and knowledge as well also contribute to that capacity. So at the beginning, when Scotland was trying to develop the strategy, it was really well resourced financially in terms of time. Over time, there was a perception that maybe we didn't need to invest as much, or maybe we could have a smaller working group. Maybe we could have 10 people who were expected to represent the sector of 6,000 instead of having 600 contributing. That's a much smaller percentage. And so, maybe there are arguments for both. And you see over time, like this is well documented in policy research, that processes become less and less collaborative. That as things turn to implementation, you need fewer actors around the table so that you don't have challenges with decision making. A smaller group can make a decision, can advance something forward. But the procedural and institutional arrangements, the framing for how kind of institutions like the government and public sector set up the process? So do you have those 20 different strategy meetings periodically throughout a strategy's lifetime, or do you only do it at the beginning? Do you say, actually, at the 5-year mark, we're just going to use a reference group or a working group, and it's only going to have 10 people on it? And you told us you wanted more social entrepreneurs, so actually, we've added 3 social entrepreneurs, and shouldn't that be great because that's a lot of grassroots voices? But who was that at the expense of? So over time in Scotland, as the process went on, the arrangements maybe did open up space for new voices and new people to be involved in the project and new people to contribute to the vision for the sector and the strategy associated with it. But it was certainly at the expense of other people and other voices. And I think that those arrangements led to perceptions of people feeling like the process was no longer creating the same level of public value. And really what almost happened in Scotland was that it went from this very collective co-production process to a little bit more of an individual co-production process. And that has to do with the arrangements. And so if you shift those arrangements, you shift who gets a seat at the table and you shift who's leading a process, then that's going to have significant impacts on how that process is perceived. Even if the, strategy itself or the services, the outcomes don't shift that much. What was so important about this was the process. Yes, the strategy, the endpoint, that was great, but it was about what surrounded it and how you got there, and how you kind of sustain engagement and build trust. And that foundation is important, but the arrangements that are contributing to that capacity for joint action is what shifts things more than anything, at least in the cases that I was studying.
Sure.
And so it's not just Scotland. I use sort of a case study in Australia as well that was preliminary, but was finding very similar things in that context as well.
So would you say, like, overall the outcome of this process of co-producing policy was successful, or was fairly successful in the case of Scotland?
It depends.
Okay,
It depends.
it's
It
fine.
depends who you
I mean,
ask.
I suppose there are no like one answer, right?
Yeah. The strategy itself, the 10-year strategy, was innovative in terms of process, in terms of how it was developed. It
Okay.
was even the fact that it was 10 years. You don't see that often. If you think
No, it
about
doesn't.
a public sector budget cycle and
Yeah.
administration changes, the fact that the government was willing at that time to take the step and say, we believe so wholeheartedly in the social enterprise sector in this country and the future direction it's going to play and the vision we have for our nation, that we are going to invest in it beyond budget cycles, beyond potential people who are in power. So who is the administration at any given time? This is going to be something that has longevity. So that was innovative, even that way of thinking, but also the way of, we're going to go to the sector themselves and ask them to, we're not just going to say, do all the work. We're going to provide the resources, the financial resources, because we're invested. But we're going to allow them to design and work with us collaboratively, to go back and forth to get that final strategy document. And then we're going to continue to develop action plans where we think about what are the key things and deliverables we want to see collectively to make sure we're realizing these goals. That was all really quite innovative. Where I think you get mixed results, and it depends on who you ask, is whether or not they believe that that philosophy, that ethos has still been sustained. So is that approach being maintained over time? That I think is much more of a, it depends. It is still probably some form of co-production. There is still a form of engagement that is very between the sector and government. But there are some people, historic voices, organizations who have been crowded out, who reflect in some ways different values
No, sure.
than those in power now. And so that is, I think Scotland is certainly a leader. They certainly have the reputation that they've developed, but has it been sustained in the way that it's been marketed? I think people agree less about that. And I would contend there are certainly shifts. I'm not going to assign some sort of value judgment around that. But if you look at the process has shifted. And I don't think that that is something people would disagree about.
Yeah, no, I think I get it. Like, of course, to simplify it, so it was successful when you look at the process, right?
Mhm.
And the trigger factor was collaboration. Is it?
Sure.
To kind of
Yeah.
summarize, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, definitely, and also you explicitly elaborate this in your thesis, like, okay, the result, of course, is important, but in this case, it wasn't the aim. I mean, the aim was to improve the process, and it happened throughout these 10 years, which I think
Mhm.
that was the success factor. That's very interesting. But look, in terms of collaboration, okay, you mentioned before, like one of the key factors that helped Scotland, at least to put in practice this process, was the still is a very small population, right? It's
Yes.
about 6 million. Okay. So I guess the big question is, okay, you don't have to answer it, but maybe if I ask you to give us some ideas, how would you translate this, kind of like successful process,
Mhm.
into other context, right? Because I think, I'm not an expert in Scottish culture, but I think collaboration also is legitimized by such a strong Scottish
Sure.
culture, right? So, what would you say, maybe, if you want to maybe implement this process in another context, knowing that perhaps they live in an atomized, you know, slash individual context.
It's a good question, and it is kind of the $1 million question
Yeah.
of what is the impact. So, okay, there's this small discrete case study on Scotland. You have a chapter on Australia. That process is nascent. Okay, yes, Australia is a bigger nation. I think that's closer to 26.5 million. But we don't know how that process is going to manifest. What is interesting about, and I've cited this example a couple times, but the African Union strategy is that one was probably less co-produced, but it's for an entire continent. But what they are asking and suggesting of member states in that strategy is that at the individual country level, that governments then work with networks. And across the continent right now, a lot of the networks are established, social enterprise networks are being established in individual countries, but also very actively collaborating between countries, sharing best practice, learning from one another, and uniting to have a stronger sort of influence by saying, well, we're doing this here, but they're also doing it over there. And therefore, the social enterprise movement gains more legitimacy in terms of movement building. To answer the question about, though, how do you do this in other contexts? In Scotland, the ecosystem grew organically and over time. This wasn't like it came out of nowhere in 2013 and all of the sudden people said, let's have a strategy 3 years later. The
Sure.
sector had been developing its own networks, had been developing its own vision and strategy for arguably 20 years. People were using different terminology before the turn of the century, but as the social enterprise terminology became more and more popularized, they developed networks and started crafting policy positions and advocating for social enterprise. And eventually, after years of work and building legitimacy and relationships for the sector, they got to a place where they were able to work with the national government in this way. In Australia, because they're doing a lot of work with the federal government right now around developing a national social enterprise strategy, the approach they've taken is, yes, eventually we would like a national social enterprise strategy. But right now, if the federal government puts out a federal budget or puts out some type of related policy where we can get them to see the value of social enterprise integrated in those other policies, because that's the approach Scotland didn't take. Scotland said, we're going to do our own strategy. And in some ways, you could argue that that has meant that social enterprise has not been integrated into the mainstream in a way that could actually allow it to take off and really be seen as a legitimate kind of mainstream economic model. It's still on the fringes. It's not part of the business department. Others could argue that's a really good thing, because then it protects the community values inherent, community enterprise values inherent in what social enterprise in Scotland has been. But if people want to do this, I think it comes from the social enterprise sector first. So, or any organization or policy, an advocacy group. It doesn't have to be social enterprise. It could be people concerned about healthcare delivery in a particular context, uniting first, developing strategy, getting a level of trust and understanding, internal visioning within a community. So then you can take something to government and say, look, we believe that this is important for you to invest in and care about, and we want to work with you on it. That needed to happen before someone in the Scottish government said, okay, yes, let's think about developing a social enterprise strategy and what that could look and feel like. And so you often find examples of localized strategies at a state level or in an individual community before you would see work happening at a national level. And that's only natural because when you think about the needs of organizations or a particular service, it's going to be informed by locality. It's going to be informed by geography. And that, I think, is organizing within from the grassroots, but within a context that seems reasonable and attainable at a particular time, is kind of how you start this work. Yes, Australia is working at the national level right now, but again, it's been a 20-year endeavor, and they have lots of very strong state networks that then have come together to sort of advocate and create a new independent entity that can do the work of pushing forward a national strategy.
Yeah. I think like the value, right? What you just described in your thesis, your PhD thesis, I think it goes far beyond, because it might be the answer for this lack of trust in between the individuals and the community with the government, right?
Yeah.
And I have this sense, like nowadays, I think more in the West, that we lost this kind of like trust with our government.
Absolutely. I mean, trust in political institutions and institutions in general is absolutely plummeting. And I think we need to be bold in how we envision the roles institutions can play in our communities to sustain engagement and build trust. And when you, from a government or a place of institutional power, can say, tell us what you need and what you want, and we want to use kind of the institutional arrangements and legitimacy we have to be more responsive to your needs. That's a productive, innovative, reimagined form of government that is maybe more sustainable, because as you see this erosion of trust, this lack of participation, the lack of social connection, that's a huge concern. And policy co-production is part of that. It's not the end all be all, but it is a tool that we have in our toolbox to sort of creatively re-envision how we should be working across sectors to build resilient and durable policies that are actually solving the problems we're trying to solve, instead of furthering divides, perpetuating existing problems, but thinking outside the box in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. I think, look, what I loved about these processes, which was actually successful, it was like eventually you gain, trust and, yeah, about democracy, about how it works. Because nowadays, people question whether democracy, could be changed for something else, because
Mhm.
people don't believe democracy exists more. So I think what you described in your thesis is game changing, because in a way, it challenges those policymakers, those politicians, who I suppose throughout the time they become maybe a little bit arrogant,
Mhm.
towards the community and the civil society. So I think these type of processes, in a way, kind of shake them off and say, hey, you can innovate and start to bring again back those voices that put you in power anyway, right?
Yeah.
At the end. And also, like, I was thinking, anyway, the outcome still, without this innovative process, doesn't matter, because nobody really
Yeah.
evaluates it, right? I
Mhm.
mean, like, okay, this process doesn't exist, they don't
Mhm.
deliver, and nobody evaluates this, there are no consequences for it. So,
It's
when you,
it's shared responsibility. It's shared responsibility. And that is a huge we talked about, but it's a discourse. It's kind of an underlying rationale for why you would engage in policy co-production. And it creates a shared responsibility, a
I love it.
buy-in, social connection, community cohesion in a way that allows us to sort of rebuild trust in the institutions that are designed to support and shifts power and status quo in certain ways, but doesn't offer an entirely new system. There's nothing revolutionary or innovative about sort of returning to this idea of the public forum and people, direct democracy. Societies are too big, right? They're even in Scotland, you're saying to me, where there are millions of people, well, how does this scale elsewhere? Well, we can still look at a policy co-production model at a very localized level,
Sure,
and
sure.
then share that up, continue to share that up.
Yeah, I suppose that's why I asked you in the beginning whether it was centralized or decentralized, because I was
Mhm.
actually imagining how that happens at a national level in other contexts, with a
Mhm.
bigger population and so on. And while you were talking about the Scotland, it kind of like connect me with the case, for instance, of Bolivia, right?
Mm.
Because they were advocating about this kind of plural state. Okay,
Yeah.
in a way, it's kind of federal, maybe as the US or perhaps as Australia, as you put it, but how
Mhm.
you bring these voices back into the policy making processes. So I think the biggest one of them, of course, your thesis has a lot of values, but the one that I stick to it is the fact that this process is being successful, and it proves that democratic processes can be more effective if you integrate participatory, like innovative collaboration processes within the actually policy making, which is great, right?
Yeah, and work to sustain them over time. And that is the hardest part, because it's not easy, but it is easier to say, okay, we're going to do some participatory engagement and we're going to get you involved now. But what about 2 or 3 years from now? In the case of Bolivia, for example, what does it signal to kind of the indigenous people in the country who have strengthened rights under the new constitution, if all of a sudden we say, well, we're going to ask you to be involved in this policy, but then we're done. this can't be a checkbox exercise. It has to be shifting mindsets
Sure.
and frameworks, because then the signal is more disenfranchisement. It's saying, okay, we're going to bring you into the fold, and we're going to recognize the contributions and values that sort of the multi-ethnic and indigenous communities or different, I mean, I'm still thinking about Bolivia, but then all of a sudden we're going to say, we don't want to engage you anymore. And so then you had this feeling of real buy-in to the process, and then that stripped away. Even if you're at a level of engagement where you were before, you're likely to perceive that to be even more exclusionary. So when we engage in these processes, we have to be sure or committed to trying as best we can to sustain them down the line, because I do think the consequences for disengagement and feeling like that there is a value destruction when they are not sustained, when people do not continue to be engaged and meaningfully included in the policies and systems that they once were, that has consequences.
Sure. And also,
Yeah.
like, throughout this process, you also like portray transparency, accountability
Mhm.
from all the sectors, which is very important. And I was thinking also, like, that setting decisions that have to be done, through participation. That's why that is so relevant, the work on Ostrom, right? About the commons.
Yes.
We really need to take care of our planet. I mean, nowadays, and throughout different podcasts, I always, like, think now we talk about sustainability so deliberately and so simply, without a proper scientific knowledge, and it's
Mhm.
being appropriated for people who, first of all, having worked in the sector for a long time, and second and foremost, they have no idea what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So when you talk about these kind of processes that includes collaboration, participation, especially with certain, resources, natural resources.
Mhm.
And that's why I was mentioning Ostrom, because
Yep.
these with the commons, it makes so much sense, isn't it?
It
That's
does.
that's
Yeah.
very interesting. I mean, honestly, it's very interesting. So
And Ostrom too, I mean, to be clear, had the seminal definition on co-production. And a lot of that kind of research around citizens playing an active role in the public goods and services that have consequence to them.
sure.
So I think, and so you think about Ostrom scholarship, it is inextricably rooted in this idea around citizens and public and collaboration.
Sure. Look, in practice, for instance, if like a policymaker, if a group of policymakers would say, Maeve, okay, we want to put this in practice. How can I apply, or yes, how I can apply these, like strategies to be more effective creating policymakers? Sorry, policies in general. What
Mhm.
would you maybe advise them? What would you say to them?
Oh gosh, if it's one thing, I think a genuine sort of open door engagement with communities is so important, because what a lot of this comes to, like a lot of the impetus, there needs to be the systems in place. So if that's an open door, if it's extra money and resources that the government has for co-production processes, because it's going to require lots of facilitation, and it's going to require time and space to sort of distill priorities for policies and services, but it's going to have to probably come from the communities and sectors you're trying to engage. So it can't, co-production is not, I'm going into this community and I'm telling you to design X for me because it aligns with our priorities. It is about having the ongoing communication with people in your constituencies, whether that's like a specific policy area. So if you're focused on healthcare, well, you want to have open communication and dialogue constantly with healthcare providers, with hospital systems, with citizens receiving healthcare services from those organizations, caregivers in sort of a more informal economy. You want all of those people to be ready and kind of engaged, but how do you actually signal that you want to work with those people in a meaningful way? Well, you spend time getting to know the people in that community, you keep kind of that open door policy, and you listen and work to provide resources when it's asked, so that if there is an opportunity to create something like a 10-year social enterprise strategy, there's already all of the foundational trust, foundational space to deliberate, to negotiate priorities, that will allow you to put in place the right procedural and institutional arrangements with the right leaders at the right time.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's so important. You know what you were working about, what you were talking about back and forth conversation.
Mhm.
I was actually thinking about agile methodologies. Okay. So I want to ask you whether or not you know about indicators. So how policymakers evaluate the policies.
Mm.
There any framework to evaluate either the processes or the outcome that you are aware of?
So that wasn't the focus of my research. It
Yeah, of
wasn't
course,
kind of an evaluation. It was much more around understanding how the process developed and everything.
Sure.
I do think that evaluation is important, and there is a growing interest, I think, from a scholarly side on co-evaluation, co-management, like what happens after something's been delivered and kind of been implemented. How do you continue to collaboratively engage on that? And I would just argue that, again, that's something that should be kind of designed and developed in collaboration with the communities. I think that's someplace where part of the dynamic shifted in Scotland is as the government started looking to prioritize different elements of the strategy, or looking at evaluating action plans in a particular way that wasn't necessarily communicated with the sector. And that's what I think led that lack of communication in terms of evaluation, in terms of why certain things were being prioritized or invested in when others were not, led to some of that breakdown in trust and legitimacy surrounding the process for particular people in the sector. So I think, yes, you could certainly find those frameworks. I would argue those frameworks are going to be more effective when they're developed collaboratively as well.
Sure, sure. I think that's a great idea, because when we're talking about these back and forth conversations, if you integrate indicators, they can revise, reconduct, and perhaps, be more efficient when they deliver, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. I want to talk about the challenges, okay? If you
Okay.
notice, I've been super over positive about this process.
And here I've been talking about all the pitfalls and challenges. You've been trying to get me to be so positive.
No, because it's very important to have the positive side. So if you
Yeah.
have to summarize, okay, the challenges that you found out or you identified, through this process based on your research, what would you say? What are the challenges, or the most common challenges, either in Scotland or in Australia?
Time, money, lack of trust that degrades over time. I don't think the challenges are going to be necessarily surprising to people, and I have alluded to them throughout the conversation. You have a 10-year strategy in Scotland, and you're not going to have the same people leading the process throughout. And so that's good. It allows something to evolve. It allows new ideas to be integrated. It is a living and breathing strategy. The challenge is also what happens when what was the vision in 5 years ago, all of a sudden has morphed into something that no longer is. I think there's another challenge too that I haven't mentioned that maybe isn't quite as evident, and that is collaboration is absolutely essential. And in fact, an overused sort of everyone must collaborate and we're only going to solve these challenges by collaboration. That is still true. I think people say it too much, and perhaps I'm even guilty of it in this podcast right now of talking about it without giving us as many concrete examples of what that looks like as we should. And I think we all need to challenge ourselves to do better at that. When you have say a third sector and public sector working together and collaborating so closely such that there's almost co-authorship of strategy and policy that is guiding their collective work, I do think that there can be a challenge with the more traditionally powerful actor in that situation, which would be the government, coming to almost co-opt what the vision for the third sector would look like. And so when you are really working closely together and when one party or individual still possesses the vast majority of the power and resources, particularly in terms of financial allocation, there is a risk that the vision and values of the community or whoever it may be in a particular situation gets either overpowered or perhaps even slightly altered, such that you end up with something 15 years later that looks different. Things are going to change over time, of course, but if the underlying values have really shifted, maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. And I think it's a challenge to be very clear and recognize when some of that negotiation may be happening so that there's time to sort of step back and reflect and say, is this the direction we want to go? Because if it is, then that's great and we should keep moving in that direction. If it's because a more powerful actor is trying to take over something that once was sort of seen as a provocative or an alternative thing, then maybe that's not so good. And I think that that's a challenge kind of inherent in some of these collaborative arrangements that are absolutely essential, but nevertheless could pose that risk.
Sure. Like you were involved in this policy event within the Social Enterprise World Forum, am I right?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay, so, for those who are not aware of Social Enterprise World Forum, is a forum that basically brings different practitioners, academics, or actors within the social enterprise sector. I'm going to have Helen in a couple of weeks to the podcast.
Okay, amazing.
She could elaborate more what it is about and how it works. But I want to ask you, of course, you were bringing into the arena, onto the same stage, policymakers and different actors, okay? What would you say, okay, based upon what you learned throughout these different events, are the more challenges, more challenging policies that some government face when it comes to the social enterprise sector? What I'm trying to say is, trying to kind of like elaborate it. Because it's very, you went to, it was Scotland when we met. Then and then we met again in Ethiopia, okay? And then we both attended online to Canada. And then you have the policy forum in Brisbane. And then the last one was in the Netherlands, okay? So it's really cool because you have such a broad perspective. So it would be very interesting to share with the audience what are the struggles as a policymakers. in order to push, like, exactly the flow in favor of
Yeah,
social
yeah,
enterprises.
absolutely. So it almost brings us back to what we started talking about. I think one of the biggest challenges is identification. So, for example, in Malaysia, they had a policy that they were going to try to invest in more social enterprises and provide government financing. The problem was actually identifying those organizations and then verifying them and then ensuring they met all the criteria to access the capital that the government had provided. So it was exceptional that the government sort of moved in this direction and said, we really value and want to provide more support and investment in these organizations that are providing public sector support, but then they had kind of the supply, or yeah, they had the money, it was appropriated, right? They didn't have the social enterprises then coming in the door ready to access it. And so, in particularly, if we talk about like a African Union or European Union strategy, when people are using different terminology to describe different things, if government says, oh, we as a national government want to spend X amount of our money with social enterprises. We know that social enterprises have office products, they have cleaning services. We need to buy these things anyway as a government. Why don't we invest them in organizations that are also employing people with disabilities, for example, because then the social impact, we're going to spend the money anyway. And now we're having greater social and environmental impact more positively with our procurement spend. That's great in theory, until you realize that then you have to develop some sort of mechanism to identify all these organizations. And what about organizations that are social washing and greenwashing? And how do you make sure that you're maintaining kind of due diligence within your supply chain? So, especially when people are using different terms,
Sure.
like, and may
Yeah,
not
yeah.
want to identify as a social enterprise, or may say, well, I'm just a nonprofit, or I'm just a business. Like, what are you even talking about? And so that's a real challenge for policymakers if we can't kind of align on the definitional aspect of those things. That poses a challenge to them for procurement, for social investment, for a lot of the different kind of policymakers have to support social entrepreneurs and social enterprise organizations. That's why I think, and maybe this is something Helen will chat with you about, but the work of many networks, I don't know what the number is up to now, but I think it's over 70 different, I don't know. We'll have to look at it, but it's a multitude of networks in countries across the world working together to develop this People and Planet First campaign, to say we actually are going to unite across terminological boundaries, across geographic boundaries, and say that we are identifying these organizations based on these standards that are putting people and planet first. You don't need to call yourself a social enterprise. You don't need to call yourself a social economy enterprise. We don't care. Are you putting people and planet first? Do you meet these basic criteria that have been developed collaboratively from the ground up with, tens, I don't know if it's in the hundreds, but it's a significant movement of organizations putting people and planet first. And that is going to have huge impacts on the ways in which policymakers can access local social enterprises. Because if you don't have some sort of social enterprise survey or registry, South Korea has a great registry. They can tell you every single social enterprise in the country. Scotland has a very good idea. Australia has a very good idea. Others don't, and that makes creating policy a challenge because you don't actually necessarily have a shared understanding of who are you making that policy with.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great idea. Yeah, and actually, like, it makes all sense now. What we just talked before. So basically, we just circle that up, and then we
Yep.
just actually, like, here you go. Like, people and planet, super simple, a simple term that anybody in any part of the world can relate with in order to enhance our sector, right?
Yes.
Yeah, how people, they put the planet and the people first. I think this is a great idea. Yeah, thanks for that, Maeve. You see,
Of course.
because I was trying, like, honestly, I was trying when I read your thesis, I was like, okay, how can I articulate this in a way that we can outreach anybody who is listening to the
Mhm.
podcast? Because to be honest, like, we as a researchers, sometimes we fail, informing and communicating our research.
Yep.
Because sometimes
I
it's too,
think you do a great job.
I hope so, because sometimes it's too complex. So what
Mhm.
I don't want is people to disconnect, right?
But
Okay.
it's not too complex, because what we're researching, yes, is the social phenomenon existing around us, but people inherently understand how they're engaging. I think we sometimes make it more complex than it needs to be, and it's a challenge to articulate it in a way that everyone can understand. I don't,
Sure.
yeah, I think that's the biggest, sign of, do you really understand and know what you're talking about? Can you connect and explain it to anyone? And I'm certainly still working on that. Just knowing that
Yeah.
the PhD is fresh, and this was such a great opportunity. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to allow me to just chat through some of these things in a different format.
Yeah, yeah. And also, like, sadly, our theses, they just are left alone in our library.
Yeah, I'm still surprised you read it, or even
Yeah, I
parts of
mean,
it. I'm
yeah,
honored.
I did. I mean, I skimmed it because it was a very thick book. But
Uh-huh.
our book, our work, is just left alone in our library, with a lot of dust. So it's great that we are able to talk about it. And that's why I want to talk about, perhaps in this last section, about your your research profile. Okay. Let me
Mm.
elaborate. Don't worry, don't panic. Because no, because like, sometimes, or at least I have these challenges. Maybe you might have the same ones, or you might not. But when you work as a practitioner in our sector, and
Mhm.
then you start to do research, you start to, you know, you have this conflict. Okay, how
Mhm.
can I put my hat as a researcher, right? And talk about these theories and make the bridge and integrate methodologies. But we need to tend to, we have to forget about this kind of like practice based, because it wouldn't be objective and so on. So I want to ask you, what are the challenges that you have faced, you know, having your background as a
Mhm.
practitioner and then getting into another field, which sometimes it can be different, right? Because then you have to read a lot, in a way you work in the intangible world, because there
Mhm.
are a lot of theories and literature. Um, so would you share with us?
Sure. I mean, it is an ongoing challenge for me to figure out how you transcend both research and practice. I think in some ways it shouldn't be seen as such a divide.
Yes.
If we approach it more from a skills and assets, and what are the values that academic researchers, or indeed, scholars in different fields who may not identify as academics, but are certainly providing important cutting edge research for our communities. And I believe that research that is more, at least in our field, at least in public management and social policy, the more you are integrated and understand the communities that your research is designed to elevate and support and advance and advocate for, the better that research is going to be, the more in touch with those people, and the better ways in which you can represent their voices and communicate their thoughts and perceptions in a way that can affect change down the road. In terms of, how I've sort of thought about it, I've been very lucky that I've been able to never I've been able to largely leave a foot in sort of both camps. if we still think about them as being divided. I think that they are certainly integrated. And that's why I loved doing the policy forum and the academic forum at Social Enterprise World Forum. But I also knew if I didn't have that job with Social Enterprise World Forum supporting on our policy and research work, I wouldn't have had access to a lot of the individuals I did who helped contribute to my PhD research. And so I'm so grateful for that back and forth. I think taking on being thoughtful about the research projects I invest in, the ones that allow me to be more connected to communities are ones that I will always want to try to prioritize. I also think that there are ways in which you can think about cycles in a career. And if you really need to be invested in a social enterprise at a particular point in time, that's great. You can do that work. Are there little pieces or breadcrumbs that you can be leaving that then allow you to go back and reflect on whatever project or process you were engaged in there in a rigorous sort of way grounded in academic methodology or what have you, to share the insights from that practical experience in a different way. So in any role or position, I think I'm always thinking about how do you engage both audiences? What are the lessons learned? What's been really exciting to me, I did a lot of work in SCW, Social Enterprise World Forum, SCWF, on verification and this like global campaign stuff. We now know that there are researchers working on those projects, trying to understand that work. And so there's always connection and collaboration between those things. I just think we need to keep talking together, collaborating. But yeah, it'll be something I hope I have an opportunity to continue to engage kind of in both fields.
Yeah, like in my case, when I get into the academia, I just became more cautious about my opinion, right? So basically, like, I don't know if you feel the same, isn't it? Like sometimes when you want to talk about something, we tend to be more neutral. Like, oh, okay, wait. Okay, there is this perspective and there is another perspective. And to be honest, we don't really like it's not like universal truth in certain aspects. So sometimes I'm kind of struggling because I tend to be super passionate, this kind of like practitioner spirit just come out, but then I have this kind of rationale of being academic, like stop myself. And then I tend to be more like careful about my opinion because still my opinion, right? And it doesn't mean not informed by literature. So would you like, when you were like conducting your research and you were talking with the actors within the sector, how would you like overcome these kind of like conversations? Because at least from the practitioner side, they tend to be super passionate. I don't know if you come across with them. They're super passionate, they're opinionated, and so.
And that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's
of
great.
course.
We need that. Yeah.
Exactly. So how do you navigate this based on your experience? And I guess, you would help those, people who are entering to this new dimension of academia. How would you suggest them to overcome, certain challenges when you talked to your, I would say, in quotation mark, research subjects? Like sometimes we refer to them like this, right? But in the end, especially when we do research about people and planet, we relate to them and in a way we connect with them. So if you can share your experience navigating these, inner emotions and.
Sure. I mean, I think that's an asset to a researcher. I think it's an asset to a researcher to have a it's not a bad thing to have a position or to have a perspective. It's a challenge if it doesn't allow you to see or uncover or reveal other perspectives, other constructions of truth. And I think in speaking to very passionate practitioners and knowing that I was seeing certain things play out in my work and not just in my research, really approaching it as these are various constructions of truth. There isn't necessarily, it is everyone could believe whether or not, in Scotland, the process was either good or it was bad, or it was co-produced or it wasn't, or it was co-produced then and it wasn't. All of that represents some form of truth to the person who I'm speaking to. And I could have a different construction or conception of that. But what my job is as a researcher, the way I tried to think about it was to connect with that emotion and passion, to draw as much out of that person's perspective that I possibly could, to then be able to articulate and share it with a wider audience.
Sure.
And so I do think it's beneficial to also have some personal connection to the work you're doing. There were questions I was able to ask in interviews that, was I not engaged the week before in a practitioner-based conference listening to someone else talk about it, I never would have been able to get that important detail out of someone who was sharing their time and expertise with me. So I think that's one of those things where being able to transcend both worlds helps make you a little bit more effective in both contexts. And sometimes not being so opinionated or being a little bit slower to share exactly what you think, even in the practice world, is also an asset. So learning that from academia and bringing it in can be useful.
Wow. Wow. I want to ask you about this kind of like journey of a hero. Imagine like you have the chance to go back to the Maeve that left the US a few years ago. Okay.
Wow.
And if
Okay.
you have, okay, and if you have the chance to talk to Maeve a few years back in the US before traveling the world, getting to know a lot of people from our sector everywhere, more mature, of course, not only professionally, but also personally. Okay, what would you say to yourself in terms of what is the biggest lesson?
Oh, just say yes to the ride, be open to the ride. I think when I first left, I had no idea I was going to start a PhD. I had no idea I would stay with Social Enterprise World Forum for so long. You can't possibly know what's lying ahead of you, and to try to chart a course. I was so set on what I was coming back to in the US and the goals I had outlined for myself, what I was going to be able to learn to bring back to a particular community, and to understand that communities are elastic and continue to shape and form in different ways. So to be open to that ride, be open to that changing community, and never setting too prescribed of a path for yourself.
Okay. Okay. So then again, you're talking to yourself back, back in time. And then, that may ask you, can you please share with me 3 or maybe 2 or 1, it's up to you, inspirational moments that in a way contribute to the Maeve that you are in the future? It could be like professionally or personally, or, you know,
Ooh. Um, Inspirational moments that have influenced the way things are. What's so interesting about my time and journey in Scotland is that there was COVID. So the world was so different. And I think that there are lots of little moments, the little, unnoticed sort of excellence around community response or around kind acts that I think really started to show themselves in different ways during that time period. I think our lives and the ways in which we develop, yes, are influenced by some inspirational moments, but I think it's really much more about the little collection of various engagements that you can't necessarily recall in something like this, that over time change and shape who you are on that journey. And so not only would I say be open to the ride and to the changing paths, but stay aware of those little unnoticed moments of excellence, because even if you can't then articulate them 5 years later when being asked to, they're still going to have had a profound impact on your journey up until that point.
Good, good. And I want to ask you, how different is Maeve back in time and Maeve nowadays, after meeting people from different contexts, doing a wonderful job, making social and environmental value. So how have you changed throughout these years?
I would hope that, and I do believe that sort of my core values and motivations are still largely the same. I'm still motivated to improve citizen engagement and to promote equitable economic development in our communities, to foster more inclusion in policymaking or spaces where people are often locked out. I mean, I sleep more. I think I've
Very
learned
happy.
how to care for myself better in the process of being motivated by some of that improving our community's work. It's become abundantly clear. I mean, I don't think anyone goes through a PhD without personal challenges and struggles, and finding how to really fill our cups more effectively before we start trying to pour out into others, I think has been a huge part of my evolution in that journey. Yeah, I think that's probably the most, and shockingly, maybe to some who still know me, a little bit more relaxed, but just coming with the knowledge that you can't necessarily plan or predict for everything. So you have to stay open to the opportunities as they come through, and doing all of this advanced planning exercise, while sometimes maybe useful, I think I've come to believe that it's better to just keep doors open and stay open to the opportunities as they come.
Wow. Do you see home the same as you are back to the US?
Oh, I call so many different places home now.
Okay. You see, that's a
Yeah,
massive change
it
because
it, it is it has changed. I think places are interesting. They're so influenced by who is surrounding you, but also the stage you are in your life. So I talk about missing Glasgow, but of course, probably what I miss more than the place, although I do love Glasgow, is the stage and what I was doing when I was doing it in that particular place. And so, you can leave a place, you will come back. You may think that the place has changed. There are new businesses, there's a changed street name, new landscaping, something like that. But what's likely to have changed more is you and your experience and interaction with the place, and not even necessarily the place itself. So yes, I see home differently, but I also think what's special about the journey I've been on is that there are now even more places that I can call home.
Wow. How Maeve would say it's important to encourage people to, or individuals to think about people and planet first.
Our lives and communities depend on it.
Okay, that's great. Maeve, I think that's the best way to to finalize our podcast. It's almost 2 hours. It's been great. It's been great. I've learned a lot. Thank you for your time. I think our audience and our community, I think they understand more about policy co-production, across the importance of collaboration, the challenges that they are. Certainly is I have a lot to think about. And, it clarifies me a lot of things while I was reading your work. Thanks a lot. It was very inspiring.
Well, thank you for having me. And it was so lovely to see you again. It has been quite a while, but I'm looking forward to continuing to follow this podcast and your work as well. So thank you again, Andreas. It's really been a pleasure.
Sure. We might see in Taiwan, right? If you go this year or next
We'll
year.
see. Yeah. Next year, lots of different conferences and opportunities. So hopefully our paths will cross in person. But the beauty of kind of the connection in the global world these days is you can still feel very connected to people, even if you're not in the same
Actual
location.
with them. Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks, Maeve. Let's take a photo. Let me just
Okay.
do a screenshot. Perfect. So with that, people, we finalize Dr. Maeve Curtin and her work on policy and social enterprises. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and we see you around. Thank you, Maeve, and thank you, everybody.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.